As we've been doing the last 2 days in this session, we'll continue with the looking at the compassion wing of practice. So remember that Buddhist traditions can be sort of grouped into these two groups, the Theravada Buddhist traditions and the Mahayana Buddhist traditions. Remember, the Theravada Buddhist traditions, based on the original Pali texts, the core of the teachings there are the Four Noble Truths, and the goal of the spiritual path is liberation from suffering, this goal of nirvana, which we looked at a little bit yesterday and we'll look at in more detail this evening. And of course, the three core areas of practice in Theravada and the Mahayana traditions is the ethics, concentration, wisdom. And that wisdom is to be balanced with compassion. And so the concentration practice in the Theravada, often called jhana practice, because that's the particular level of concentration that is mainly taught in the Theravada traditions. Whereas in the Mahayana traditions, which are based on primarily these perfection of wisdom teachings, when they talk about concentration practice, you'll usually see this word shamatha. That's the level of concentration that is most widely taught in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions. And then on that basis of the concentration practice, we engage in the wisdom practice. And we saw yesterday there that for the Theravada Buddhist traditions, when they talk about the wisdom or vipassana practice, we're talking about these three marks of existence, to come to realize impermanence, suffering, and no self. Whereas when we talk about wisdom or vipassana practice in the Mahayana, then of course we come to these three insights, but at the deeper level, this insight into emptiness. So mainly when we talk about vipassana practice in Mahayana Buddhist traditions, which of course includes Chinese Buddhism, Zen, Korean, Vietnamese, Tibetan, Mongolian, then we're mainly talking about this wisdom of emptiness, and this is something we'll look at in a little bit of detail on day 9 when we go into this vipassana practice a little bit. But of course this needs to be balanced with the compassion wing of practice. And at the foundation level, at the level of Theravada, the compassion wing of practice are these 4 immeasurables. In Theravada, these are often called the 4 Brahma Viharas. And that's what we're currently looking at. Loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity. Whereas in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions, when we talk about the compassion wing of practice, of course we're cultivating these 4 immeasurables, but then we build on those to another level, to this level of bodhicitta. And if we get time today, we'll start to touch on this a little bit and then look at this a little bit more tomorrow as well. So therefore, at the moment, we're looking at these 4 immeasurables. And this word immeasurable here means we are cultivating these qualities towards immeasurable living beings. In other words, all living beings. And the first quality we looked at was loving kindness, which is a translation of the Sanskrit word maitri and the Pali word metta. So remember, loving kindness was simply defined as the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. So, of course, immeasurable loving kindness is simply the wish for all living beings, all sentient beings, to have happiness and its causes. And so what we saw here, of course, is that loving kindness here is not an emotion, it's an aspiration, it's a wish. And so if we want to cultivate that aspirational wish for happiness and its causes, then we need to know what is happiness, what are the causes of happiness, how do we cultivate those. So we had a look at those in terms of the two types of happiness, the temporal happiness and the genuine happiness. And here we're mainly, of course, focusing on genuine happiness, but not at the cost of temporal happiness. It's not a choice. That if we are actually striving for genuine happiness, you'll find that actually you'll enjoy the simple pleasures in life much more than you do now, because you won't have that craving and attachment to them, hoping that they're going to fulfill us and satisfy us. And of course, what is the source or causes of happiness? And so this genuine happiness is a state of inner well-being, of being completely in harmony with the interdependent nature of reality. And we achieve that, of course, by eliminating our distorted view of reality through the Vipassana practice of emptiness, thereby eliminating all mental afflictions and suffering. And the second quality, and of course here we had a look at attachment and how to distinguish that from loving kindness. So remember, attachment was defined as a mental factor that sees its object as attractive, it exaggerates the object's attractiveness, and therefore wishes to possess and hold the object. Why? Because attachment believes that object is the source of our happiness. And we saw there in the context of a relationship that we need to distinguish loving kindness from attachment. Because generally they're sort of mixed together. And it's our attachment that actually interferes with our relationships. So to improve our relationships, we really need to be able to distinguish loving kindness from attachment and increase the healthy aspect, the loving kindness, and decrease the unhealthy aspect, the attachment. And in a relationship, the healthy aspect, loving kindness, is really focusing on the other person, simply wishing them to be happy. Whereas, of course, attachment in a relationship is not really focusing on the other person, it's focusing on me. And seeing that person as something to satisfy me. So that we need to get rid of, because that's just creating problems in our relationships. And we'll talk a little bit more about this loving kindness attachment relationship a little bit later in this session. The second quality, which we looked at yesterday, was compassion, in Sanskrit and Pali, karuna. And here compassion was defined as the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. And of course, immeasurable compassion is the wish or aspiration for all living beings to be free of suffering and its causes. And so here again, compassion, like loving kindness, is not an emotion, it's an aspiration, it's a wish. And if we want to cultivate this wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes, then we need to know what is suffering, what are the causes of suffering, how do we eliminate those causes. And here when we looked at this word suffering, it was a translation of this word dukkha. So here, we're not just talking about being free of unpleasant experiences. At the deepest level, we're really talking about being free of this all-pervasive dukkha, the potential for suffering to arise in our life. And to be free of that means to eliminate the cause, which is, of course, the mental afflictions, particularly distorted view of reality. And understanding that we can eliminate this distorted view of reality through the wisdom practice of emptiness. If we understand these things, then we can really cultivate compassion for ourselves and others. And what we saw there was, for both of these, it's very much recommended we cultivate them in stages. Usually the classical presentation is first friend, then stranger, then difficult person, then all living beings. But we added one more stage at the beginning, which I think we really need to work on in our modern society, and that is first cultivate loving kindness and compassion for ourselves. Because if we're not kind and compassionate for ourselves, we won't be able to extend that out to others. So we cultivate these in those stages. And here, yesterday, together with compassion, we looked at anger. And so we saw the anger there is really the sort of the flip side of attachment. In that anger is a mental factor that sees its object as unattractive, it exaggerates the object's unattractiveness, and then wishes to harm the object. Why? Because it believes that object is the source of our suffering. And then in yesterday's presentation, we looked at this idea of cognitive fusion. How we very often, here in this context in particular, identify ourselves and others with behaviour. So if someone's behaving badly, rather than simply acknowledging there's a person engaging in harmful behaviour, or I have just done a harmful thing, we often fuse those two things together and see there's a bad person or I'm a bad person. And we saw there that if we do this cognitive fusion, and we tend to do that a lot in our modern society, then we end up getting angry at people, attacking people, or attacking ourselves. When in fact the thing we don't like is the behaviour, but because we've fused it to the person, we end up directing our rejection to the person in the form of anger towards others and toward ourselves. Not useful. So, of course, the solution is to don't do cognitive fusion, because it's a false, invalid perspective. And to simply correctly acknowledge and see there's a person engaging in harmful behaviour, or I have just done a harmful behaviour. Then we can accept the person, meaning have compassion for that person or for ourselves, and at the same time not tolerate, reject the negative behaviour and address the negative behaviour. So I think this is one thing that can be very helpful in being able to cultivate compassion for people who behave badly instead of getting angry. So they're the first two qualities, and what I'd like to do now is look at the other two qualities. But before I do that, is there any last questions about any of those two that we looked at in the last 2 days? Okay. So the third one is empathetic joy. And empathetic joy in Sanskrit and Pali is mudita. And empathetic joy is a rejoicing in our own and others' virtue and good fortune. And when we talk about immeasurable empathetic joy, it's often described as this wish or aspiration for all beings never to be separated from their happiness. And this empathetic joy, I think particularly in our modern society, is extremely important. Because again, in our modern society, we tend to have this obsessive focus on the negative. And even worse than that, when we focus on the negative, we do that with cognitive fusion. So we end up with a fixed, biased view of ourselves and others. And in fact, this obsessive focus on the negative creating a distorted view, I saw that very clearly recently. They did a study, I think it was in the US somewhere, I think it was in some town or region, and they surveyed people there and asked them that has things improved or got worse in the last 5 years, or I think 5 or 10 years it was, and it was in terms of crime, violence, you know, all of these sorts of things. And the response was definitely yes, it's got worse. Actually, statistically, it had got better. But because the perception is from the media, the news just pumps out all this negative stuff, people's perception is, oh, it's getting much worse. When in fact, in that region, over the past 5 or 10 years, actually it got better. Less crime, less violence and so forth. But people's perception was the opposite. So I think it's important that we focus on the positives of ourselves and others. Otherwise, we really end up with a wrong view of ourselves and others and the world in general. And of course here, we also need to be careful to avoid cognitive fusion. Because cognitive fusion on the positive side also is not helpful. So here, empathetic joy is a rejoicing in our own and others' virtues and good fortune. Which means, if someone's doing something good, or we're doing something good, what we don't want to do is praise the person. Because if we praise the person, and saying they're a good person, fantastic person, then chances are they'll just get a big head thinking they're very special. Bit of an ego trip. Whereas, to avoid cognitive fusion, we praise the behaviour. So instead of saying you're a fantastic person, rather, correctly, we should say you did a fantastic thing. And that will probably more likely lead to them in encouraging them to continue to do that good behaviour. Whereas if you just tell them they're a fantastic person, it's not even addressing their behaviour. They're just going to go, oh yeah, I'm fantastic, aren't I? Even better than saying you did a fantastic thing, leave out the agent. Because even if you say you did a fantastic thing, because they probably do a lot of cognitive fusion, they will interpret that as, oh yes, I'm a fantastic person. So even better than saying you did a fantastic thing, to say that's a fantastic thing to do. Leave out the agent. Then even less likely they'll fuse with that themselves. Similarly with ourselves, if we do a good thing, we must praise our behaviour, but don't praise yourself. Otherwise you'll just get a big ego trip. And this empathetic joy also is very much an antidote to jealousy. Because generally in our modern society, if someone else does something good or has something good happen to them, we become jealous of them. So rejoicing in that is really a very good antidote to jealousy. And in general, in spiritual practice, it's said that there are 2 activities that we can do to support all practices. And they are often described as purification and accumulation. What this means is purification is to purify our mind of negative imprints and negative habits. So we're talking about purifying negativities.
It's about the whole form miracle?
Sorry?
The supports.
No, so these supports are for all practices. Shamatha, Vipassana, every practice we do to support that, in general, we have these two aspects of purification and accumulation. So purification is about purifying the mind of negative habits, negative imprints. And accumulation here is really talking about what's called accumulating merit. And merit is the result of virtue. So basically what we're talking about here is reducing the negative aspects of our mind and increasing the positive aspects of our mind. Because the more we can do that, the more our mind will be in a very good condition to support practice. Because as long as we have a lot of negative things going on in the mind, that's going to make it difficult to do any practice. And if we don't do any positive actions, we don't really have any positive states of mind, we don't have enough sort of positive energy for practice. And we often hear this in Tibetan Buddhism, in Tibetan culture. You know, if someone's trying to do some good actions and it's not really working very well, often you'll hear the Tibetans say, oh, they don't have enough merit. They don't have enough merit. You know, if they're trying to meditate on emptiness and not really getting anywhere, often they say they don't have enough merit. Meaning they've not done this. Meaning we haven't developed the positive states of mind enough to support the practice. Purification is often presented as what's called the four opponent powers. So these are four things we can do. If we've noticed we've done some negative behaviour, these are four things we can do to purify our mind of that negative imprint and negative habit. The first is regret. To cultivate sincere regret for having done that negative behaviour. Of course, here we need to distinguish between regret and guilt. Because if we've done something harmful and we feel guilty, what are we focusing on? Bad me. So guilt comes from cognitive fusion. So it's coming from an invalid perspective. So we never need to feel guilty about anything. And it's not useful, because all it does is it paralyses us and makes us feel bad. It's not even addressing the negative behaviour. Rather, if we have the correct perspective and acknowledge I did this harmful thing, then we can develop regret because we're focusing on the negative behaviour. The second thing that we can do is what's called reliance, or sometimes called foundation. What this means is that if we've done something harmful, we've sort of really fallen down from our sort of basis in life, you know, our platform, the positive direction we're trying to follow our life. So this second step is about picking ourselves back up and reaffirming the positive direction of our life. Now, if we are following a Buddhist path, and in particular we are following the Mahayana, this usually takes on the form of going for refuge to Buddha Dhamma Sangha and generating bodhicitta. Because in Mahayana, bodhicitta is the positive direction we want to follow our life. If we're not Buddhist, this may simply take the form of something like, I want to benefit others as much as I can, as an example. But just reaffirming our positive direction that we want to follow our life. So that's also going to work against that negative behaviour. The third step is remedy. Remedy is think of some practical remedy for that negative behaviour. For example, if we verbally abuse someone at work, the remedy could be go and apologise. So do something positive opposite to that behaviour. If for whatever reason that's not possible, then any virtuous action with the motivation of wishing to overcome that negative behaviour can be effective. The long-term remedy, of course, is the Vipassana practice of emptiness. Because all negative behaviour is based on ignorance. So to eliminate all negative imprints and habits in our mind, the long-term remedy is to wipe them out through the Vipassana practice of emptiness. But that could take a long time. So in the short term, some practical remedies, opposite, positive opposite. And the fourth opponent power is resolve. And resolve is to make a strong determination not to do that negative behaviour again. But here we need to be practical. Because if the negative behaviour is a very strong habit we do very often, there's no point in saying I'm never going to do it again. It just won't happen. So if it's a very strong habit, set a time limit and say maybe for the next day I'm not going to do that. If that's way too difficult, for the next hour I'm not going to do that. If that's way too difficult, for the next 5 minutes I'm not going to do it. So pick an amount of time that with effort normally you can manage. And then over time you can extend from 5 minutes to 10 minutes to an hour, a day, a week, a month, a year, the rest of your life. In that way we can even start to break strong habits. So of course, ideally, the ideal situation would be if, as soon as we've realised we've done something harmful, to go through these 4 points, to develop sincere regret, reaffirm positive direction of life, apply some sort of practical remedy, and make strong determination not to do it again. If we do those 4 things, that's a very effective way of purifying the mind from that negative imprint, negative habit. But in a practical way, at least what we can do is every day, before we go to bed, is to review our day. How did our day go? And then just pick one negative behaviour we did during the day, because if you pick more than one, it'll become too much effort to do, and you won't do it. So just start by picking one, and then go through these 4 points. But equally important, maybe